Dr. Jeannelle Perkins-Muhammad is a licensed family therapist who also has expertise in leadership. She's also a known commodity on the TV1 hit series Fatal Attraction. Now, Dr. Muhammad has a best-selling book called Intimacy about Black intimacy and relationships. I talk one-on-one with Dr. Muhammad for this edition of Quintin's Post-Ups. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my YouTube channel and like Quintin's Post-Ups on Facebook. Dr. Jeannelle Perkins-Muhammad, welcome to Quintin's Post-Ups.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Oh, you're very welcome. You know, you are a licensed family therapist who actually also have expertise in leadership, and you are a known commodity on the TV1 hit series Fatal Attraction. You also now are the author of a book titled Intimacy, Mastering Black Intimacy for the Relationship You Always Wanted. Let me ask you, who else is Dr. Muhammad these days?
Oh, my word. I would say that I happen to be a great friend to a number of people. I think that every encounter that we have, every experience is about building relationships. So I'm always keen to be very present in relationships and understanding the emotional intelligence of what's happening around me, as well as how it's impacting those who are experiencing my own emotions. So it's a huge part of who I am is present.
Present.
Mm-hmm.
On a general basis, Dr. Muhammad, how should people go about building relationships these days?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really quite interesting because I think first we have to understand that just as I said a moment ago, when we encounter one another, whether it's in a work environment or with family or play, fictive kin, if you will, we really are building relationships at that point. And oftentimes when I talk about relationships, people automatically go right for romantic. But I'm talking about everything in between.
Sure.
Because the truth of the matter is, if you're not able to communicate effectively with your siblings, with your coworkers, you're going to have difficulty communicating with a romantic partner, particularly when the emotions are high.
And what type of emotions are you hearing right now about different types of relationships, whether it be business, friend, or actual romantic?
Yeah, I think to some degree they're the same. They are feelings of irritation and anger or frustration with the inability sometimes to communicate effectively. And so when those emotions rise, sometimes it makes a lot more sense to step back for a moment, if you can, and figure out where it's coming from. Why are you feeling angry about not being able to communicate? What words are you using that you might do differently so that you get your point across? And more importantly, are you listening for the purpose of understanding or for the purpose of responding? Because that's going to be very different depending on the situation that you're in.
And when you talk to your couples, do they go with the purpose of understanding or just responding?
Initially responding. Everybody wants to defend themselves in one way or another, right? And so learning how to communicate such that you're now actually doing some effective listening where you're actually communicating using the proper vocabulary is so important. There are small buttons that are pushed on a regular basis, and you kind of know what those words are. Regardless of the person, whether it's a coworker or your lover, you know what words are going to get them going. So being able to really pull back and figure out, how can I say this better? What can I do that's going to make this a smoother conversation so that we can get to the end result that we're hoping for?
And when things go head to head in relationships, other than emotions rising, what else is rising when it comes to these relationships?
Oh, I would say it's a lot of history. A lot of the work I do takes us back into family dynamics and what has occurred over the course of learned behaviors, which sometimes leads to learned helplessness. You learn that it doesn't make sense to keep trying. But if you take the opportunity to figure out what are the relationship scripts that you've come to believe about the way a thing should, ought to, could work versus being present enough to determine what you want for this relationship, for this encounter,
right?
Not for what your mom and daddy had and your grandparents had, because this is a different day and age and it's not going to look the same. But what is it that you're expecting out of the relationship? How do you want to connect within the relationship? And Are you really digging deep enough in your history that you know why you're pulling baggage forward and unpacking it on someone else?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Whew. So, oh my God, there's so much to talk about right there. But what's different about relationships from 20 years ago to right now?
Mm. I think it's the fact that we know more. So we have a greater understanding of emotions
Mm.
and how they impact us daily. We have a greater understanding of those emotions and how they create behaviors.
Mm.
And we also understand how to create boundaries and set boundaries. We understand that boundaries are not for punishing the other person,
Right.
but literally for the purpose of keeping you safe
Right.
emotionally, spiritually, cognitively,
Right.
and physically sometimes. So that understanding really didn't exist so much back in the day. We kind of accepted whatever came because we believed that we had to. There are studies that demonstrate that, I mean, we were born with all of 6 emotions, only 6. So we're talking surprise, disgust, fear, sadness, happiness, and anger. Those are the only 6. And yet there are thousands of emotions available. Thousands. But if you have never seen those emotions expressed, particularly in history, you didn't want to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
And no one's going to show you what it's like to feel betrayed unless it shows up in anger, right? So if all you know is to be frustrated and throw things around or cuss somebody out, and all you know is to, tell them that what you ain't going to do and who you ain't going to be and what they ain't going to do to you, right? Then you don't recognize that you could actually sit with someone and say, at the current time, I recognize that what has occurred is not going to put us in a good space. And what I want to do is figure out whether or not we want to move forward by working on it, or if we want to say, this is not going to work at all.
And I've been around a lot of people who cuss and do things, and it's not a good sight, obviously. But let me ask you this too, Dr. Muhammad, and this is a silly but obvious question. But when you talk to your clients, what exactly do they want out of a relationship?
Everyone wants to be seen, heard, loved, appreciated, respected, honored. That's what they want. It's a matter of how you get there and what that looks like. Because to be seen to one person can look very different for another. To be loved for one person can be very different for another. And it's the reason why I think it's so important not to just put a blanket over this is what the relationship ought to be, as much as it is to ask yourself, what is it that I want in being loved? Because the person who hopes for an individual who spends majority of their time with them is not going to be wanting to have a relationship with an entrepreneur who's out there constantly trying to make money. Because they can't be home at 5:00 every day. They may not be able to have dinner every night. You may not see them on some weekends. So that's not your person. But if you don't know that's what you want, truly writing it down and being able to express it, then all you see is that fine brother walking down the street who sounds good, looks good, smells good, and you're like, ooh, I want that. And you're not thinking about all the deep parts of their character that create that love and attention and affection.
Yeah, and I look, I look at that way when it comes to the females, like, oh, and so, but
well, that's what Into Me See is about, right? That's why I wrote it, because it's about looking beyond the physicality and what you see and actually digging deeper to the cognitive, the emotional, and the spiritual component of who that person is. When you get to that place where you really begin to understand their history, their present, where they want to go in life, the physical will fall into place. And it will be that much more pleasurable.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Dr. Muhammad, when it comes to relationships, what do you see your clients actually putting blankets over when it comes to a relationship?
Oh, what it ought to be. They take things that are seen on the internet and they say, this is what they say you ought to do. Here's the blueprint. But you get the opportunity to write your own blueprint. You get to set the expectations and write the script, if you will. You get the opportunity to understand how you want to communicate with one another, right? If you don't like raised voices, being able to say that without necessarily telling the person they're bad or wrong, simply that it's more effective when you speak with me in a calmer tone. But if you wait until it's piled up, it's just all going to explode anyway. So taking those, this is what it ought to be, and trying to make it your own is not going to work. You really have to stop. I always say, pull out a flip chart, get the sticky ones that stick on the wall, and start writing down and pulling apart what your expectations are until you come to a happy medium. And it might take more than one day to do that. It might take more than a few hours, but it means that you also get an opportunity to say, okay, this is enough. I can't do any more. Let's come back to this on whatever day, and then honor it and be consistent with coming back to it, so that you have a chance to really say, this looks good. Now let's keep this up, so that we can see that it's expected that if I'm going to be late, that I'm going to make the phone call. That's not common sense. Common sense is what's common to that man or woman's experience. Right? So if you know that you want to hear from me at half an hour before you're going to be late, you have to say something. If it happens over and over again and now you're angry, that's on you, because you should have spoken up. So being able to be assertive and advocating for what you need and want is so important in a relationship. We sound like we're talking about a business. The difference is we're making it relational and not transactional.
There you go. Exactly right. And how many of those couples and your clients do you see actually reach that happy medium when they're consistent and honest?
There's the key: consistent and honest, and do the work. You have to do the work. It's not that I think that it's hard. It's just that you have to have two people who are willing to truly do the work. And when they are, then they find those spaces where happiness exists. It's not going to be all the time roses and perfume and chocolates and, going on beautiful runs together across the beach. No, there are going to be days where you have to actually get in there and say, hey, I don't like you today, but I still love you. I don't like what you just did or what you just said, and here's what I think we can do to make it different. But two people have to do that. When you're doing it alone, it can be very challenging. So those who really take the opportunity to dig deep and to do the work, the homework, even, they really do see a lot of success. And it's not going to change overnight. If you've been together for 18 years and you got here in 18 years, it's not going to take you 3 months to get out of that. So the consistency of coming to therapy, of doing the homework, of actually practicing what you're supposed to be doing, even when you're not in an argument. Practice when you're not having a bad day, so that it becomes a part of the character of the relationship.
I hate to ask this too, Dr. Muhammad, but what should be the character of a relationship?
What you create. Everybody's going to be different. The keys are going to be effective communication, but the way you communicate effectively is going to look different from the next person, right? Resilience, having the ability to bounce back from bad situations, being emotionally intelligent, emotionally regulated, recognizing how your emotions are impacting the room overall, and then being able to read the room and see when someone is sad or excited, or even if they are irritated and it doesn't have anything to do with you, being able to, oh my goodness, ask for clarification. Is this about me right now? No, this is about something that happened at work, and give me a few minutes, let me work through it, and then we'll talk about it. That's the character of the relationship. But you have to build the details of it.
And what details do you usually see a couple build when it comes to their relationship?
I think the biggest one is really how they treat one another. So we talk about communication, but 97% of communication is body language.
Mm.
3% are the words you say. Now, don't get me wrong. Sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's not true.
Right.
Words hurt, and they're very, very powerful.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, how you respond to someone in terms of the body language makes all the difference in the world. It's communicating as well.
Mm.
So if I'm saying to you, I love you, and I'm sitting with a face that looks like I really do have an affection for you versus I love you. That's body language.
Right.
You heard my words.
Right.
I said the same thing, but my body language said, boy, bye. Oh, no, nothing to do with you. No, right? So it's all about being able to be congruent in your words and your deeds.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. In going back to what you just said, why did you want to put that into me see right now?
Well, it's interesting because over the pandemic, we saw a number of people who were struggling tremendously because guess what? You had to spend a lot of time with your mate, with your partner, right? And so you saw things that maybe you didn't normally see because you're running the kids back and forth to school plays and soccer games and whatnot, or you were working extensively. And so you didn't spend as much time with them, or you found yourself being able to connect with family, and you had these outlets where you could tell people what you were thinking was happening, which is going to be another thing. Don't be telling everybody your business. So you could tell everybody what was happening in your relationship, and somebody might help you work something out, right? Well, with the pandemic, we didn't have that. And we know that about 50%, unfortunately, of marriages fail. And so when I started looking more deeply throughout the work I'm doing with African American families and couples and individuals even, what I realize is that, okay, we know it's a true statistic, but let's look a little deeper at it. Mm-hmm. I now live in the South. And in the South, we have the highest divorce rates. Mm-hmm. And South Carolina happens to be number 11 in the statistics that just came out in 2023. So let's now break that down across the U.S. in terms of the African American community. We're talking 30%. We have the highest rate of divorce, 30% divorce in the U.S., in the African American community. And then when we look at the churches, which is a place we go, right, in order to get healing and wholeness, even for relationships, we're the highest. The Black church has a 19% divorce rate. It's the highest of all the religious groups. So there's something we're missing.
Yes.
And it's not the spiritual component. I know that to be true. I was raised in the church. My parents were ministers. It's not the spiritual component. We have an incredible grasp for that. But what we often miss is the practical steps to what we need to do in the natural to combine with the spiritual so that we then can say, how do we work this so that we're just like that clock on the wall? All the cogs going smoothly, everything oiled. Yes. And when it has a hiccup and the time is slightly off, we know how to get in there and adjust it. And so Into Me See is that strategy of, hey, here's some people who have done some things. And they didn't do them all well, but they figured out what they needed to do differently. And now they're at least at a place where they're moving forward more positively. So it really was about looking at those stats and thinking, the greatest generational wealth we can truly give is emotional and mental wellness. Because you can give all the money you want, all the property you want, but if they don't know how to regulate their emotions, if their mental health is steeped in anxiety and depression, and they're spending the money to cope, then we really haven't done our community a great service.
And when you go back to those stats from this year, obviously, Dr. Muhammad, what else surprised you?
I think the church stat was the biggest one for me. I had not recognized that the Black church in and of itself had the highest divorce rate. I knew it was high, but I didn't, because we think about it, we make up 14% of the U.S. Right. And not all of us go to church, so we're not monolithic, right? So for that to be 19% was really surprising for me. I think the other thing that probably stood out would really be the fact that we weren't doing very much about it. So when
Mm,
the questions were asked, what did you try? Like, did you go to therapy? That most of the time it was, I talked to friends.
mm,
I went to church, and I'm not saying church is bad. I love the Lord. Don't nobody call me now. So, but what I'm saying is there are professionals out there that could assist. And we didn't take the time to look at the mental health component of it.
mm.
And at the end of the day, with our 14% in the US, about 16% of us have a diagnosed mental health condition. 16%. And we don't think about that. That's about 6 million people
Right.
diagnosed. So that means, like the Uncle Joes and the so and so that we don't talk about, they're not diagnosed. We just know there's a little something different, right? So the stigma has created this environment where we don't want to
Mm.
talk about it. So let's think about that for a second.
Okay.
If 6 million African Americans have a diagnosed mental health condition, and many of them are not getting any treatment whatsoever, and most are in a relationship, because remember, I said every encounter, every experience you have with another person, right? That means that you're talking about the population of cities like
Oh,
Philadelphia,
yes.
um, population of Houston and
Oh,
Chicago
yes.
combined,
Yes.
all of the population. So not just the African Americans in those cities, but all of their population is what we're talking about as having a challenge. So we have a mental health, anxiety or depression or bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever
Mm.
that might look like, entering into relationship
Yes.
with no help, and we're ignoring it because of the stigma.
Mm.
And so isn't it any wonder that our stats are so high for divorce?
Mm.
Isn't it any wonder that we're having such struggles with our finances? I mean, we got the system that's doing its thing, and then we're also working against ourselves by ignoring what we could be doing. So I wrote Into Me See to open that box to say, here's some mental health challenges that might be impacting us. Here are the communication challenges that are impacting us. Here are the institutional racism challenges that are impacting us. And here's some of the things we can do about it.
What about wealth gap? The wealth gap, I should say.
That's a huge component of it. I mean,
Mm.
it goes all the way back to slavery and Jim Crow laws and redlining, and which all still happens today. So I think about it like this: imagine that you do have a fairly good job, you make pretty good money, and you and your family are doing well. But every time you go to work, you're having to impact levels of racism that you can't really talk about with anyone on the job. But when you get home, you're so angry and bottled up that you can't really talk about it at home. And before you know it, the home that you've purchased, because you've been so angry for so long, you now are having to refinance because maybe you went out and spent too much money and you need to pay off some credit cards and you need to, like those coping skills, maybe turning to alcohol, maybe. So we're creating a greater wealth gap
Mm.
by the coping skills that we're implementing to work through the relationship challenges that often stem from mental health challenges,
Mm.
that often stem from racial challenge. And it just snowballs because
Mm.
we have to stop at some point and say, wait a minute, what do we need to do differently to make this work?
And what are those other stigmas because of COVID that are really creeping into these relationships?
Stigmas because of COVID, I think one of the things that's happening has more to do with our youth.
Mm. Yeah.
So we have children who were born during COVID who really don't have a lot of social emotional learning.
Mm.
So you have parents who didn't get it, but now you have a pandemic that created a space where you had to wear a mask, and all I get to see are your eyes. And so now I don't really know that you're telling me a joke
Mm.
or that this is supposed to be anger, or is this that? What is this exactly? So we have a whole generation that's coming up that's going to need to learn even greater have greater classes on what it is to have some social emotional learning. Then we have us. I don't know what generation you're in. I won't say mine right now, but we have us who didn't really get an opportunity to work through those emotions. And then we get into a pandemic situation and we
Mm.
have another set of stigma on the relationship
Yeah.
because he doesn't, she doesn't, they won't, they look at us. We're all on our phones and in our computers. Nobody's trying to have a conversation during
Listen.
dinner. People are accepting things they would never have accepted before the pandemic
Right.
because feel as though, well, half a man is better than no man at all.
Mm.
And if you can bring the hammer, you might as well. And so we just keep perpetuating
Mm.
those relationship challenges
Mm.
without stepping back to ask ourselves, what do we need to do differently? And this Into Me See is an opportunity to at least crack open the book and say, let me see if I see myself in any way. And if I do, what do I plan to do about it?
When you cracked open your own book after publishing it and everything, what were
Mhm.
your table of feelings?
I think the biggest one for me went back to the mental health piece.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a lot of lived experience in this space. I have gone through a divorce as a result of mental health issues. And the fact that the other person was not willing to work to do anything different. And when you have a diagnosis and you know there is a treatment for it, and the stigma stands up and says, I won't acknowledge it, you now have decisions you have to make. And I think when I went through the finishing process of this book and began to really take a look at how many people say things like, well, you have a failed marriage, so you can't help me. Or you're not married, so you can't help me. Or you don't look like me, so you can't help me. It really solidified for me in this that those aren't truths. Experience is a truth. And experience with theory that is proven to work is a truth that can get you to the next level. So regardless of those three things, what do you need and how do you get it to make your relationships better? Because that's what's going to help us move forward in life.
And when people do put down your book, what do you want them to walk away with?
Oh, love. Immense, immense love for self, for others, the ability to really pull in a partner, the ability to communicate effectively, whether it's a romantic or platonic relationship. More than anything, a recognition that when you have a cognitive vulnerability, an emotional vulnerability, and a deeper understanding of your own spiritual self, you get to write for you your script of relationship and what you want it to look like. And I don't think there's anything better in the world than to be able to have someone walk this path with you, whether you want to marry them or just be in a long-term committed relationship. But to walk that path in peace and harmony and joy, and it's what you want and not what everybody tells you you ought to have.
Wow.
That's what I want them to walk away with.
And now, Dr. Muhammad, you're married and you're doing well in your career and everything. Who are you, from a spiritual standpoint?
So let me first say I'm not married.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. But I want to make sure nobody gets that out there, right? It's okay. I am a child of God.
Yes.
I love the Lord with everything in me. I was raised in the church and wounded by the church. And yet I recognize that I don't have to stay there. I can actually choose what emotions I feel and express toward the church because those are people like I am. They are on a journey like I am. More than anything, It's my relationship with Christ
Yes.
that makes all the difference in the world. And nobody can tell me what that is except me.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Dr. Muhammad, if you were to have, say, part two of this book, what would be the
Mhm.
title now that we have COVID and all these other issues going on in relationships?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Um, oh, I made it with you. That would be it.
Wow.
Because I think that what we forget is that we all are on a journey
Yes.
and everybody plays a part. I made it with you.
Yes. That's amazing. That's really amazing. Well, Dr. Jeannelle Perkins-Muhammad, thank you so much for your time. And again, welcome to Quintin's Close-Ups.
Thank you. I appreciate the time.
Oh, you're very welcome.